Welcome back to New Persuasive Words. I'm Scott Jones.
And I'm Bill Borror.
Bill, we've passed Halloween, we've passed All Saints Day, heading into the next week. And yet we're looking back. We're looking back to the Reformation today. What a country that we live in today. I mean, I think Luther might look at it and say peasant revolts weren't so bad.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Yeah, what would Luther say about this mess? I don't know. That would be good. It'd be interesting.
Well, I mean, the people, certainly without food stamps, the peasant revolt would be worse. They didn't have food stamps back in the day.
No, they did not.
No, the average peasant. What do you, they burn a lot of calories. The average peasant.
Well, yeah, they did. And Luther came from peasant stock, at least on his father's side.
But he didn't look like he was burning many calories, Luther.
Well,
in the artwork I've seen,
Luther, right? He kind of ruined his digestive system as a monk, so he never quite. He's pretty emaciated as a younger man.
That's the look today. The look is to be emaciated. Although I follow these masculine Orthodox priests that say that's the Timothy Chalamet mustache look, and it's really feminized masculinity. That you want to be big and bulky. That's what these Orthodox priests who are training very vigorously for what the only inspiration I can imagine is a new crusade where they would be riding on the Middle East, just riding. I guess these guys they look like they're aspiring crusaders.
They do. Yeah.
You would have to be pretty, I think, you'd have to be a pretty strong stack. You put on the chainmail and the plate mail.
Yeah, no, you were not. You had to be in good shape. Yeah. And those videos you sent me, they don't seem like they'd be that discriminating who they would kill.
Well, this is part of their charm. Well,
they're just trying to. They're not against diversity as long as the diversity all agrees with them. Would that be?
Well, of course. I mean, who's against that kind of diversity? I love that kind of. Yeah, I watched the whole 90 minutes of the Trump interview with Norah O'Donnell. Watched the whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah, it was something. It was something. So interesting. 9 wars, all the wars. No wars would have happened. Helen of Troy, they would have worked that out. Everything in world history is because Trump wasn't in charge. Largely, it can be.
Is that from? I can't remember which movie that's from, where the dean at the end says, "We are now all more stupid because of your speech. May God have mercy on your soul."
God have mercy. Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, it was fascinating. It's Nora O'Donnell. I mean, you sit there the whole time. I just don't imagine. I imagine like what kind of indignity it is in some sense to try to do. No, of course, every political interview is to some degree adversarial, and everyone wants to put their administration or their legislative record in the best possible light, but there are limits. And wow. Especially the crypto guy that was, she's like this guy that he pardoned that, this huge merger with the guy and his crypto coin, all this stuff that's so murky and weird. You pardon this guy. I don't know who that is. And like she's like, well, you pardoned him. Well, and it was a Biden. I mean, it was a Biden persecution. So it's funny because he didn't know who he was, but he knew that he was persecuted by Biden.
Yeah.
Who was the most corrupt president we've ever had.
Right. Yeah.
I learned that from the interview.
Right.
I learned many things. I learned many things. Yeah, Bill. So that's 90 minutes I'll never get back.
90 get back to your life. Yeah. So what are your thoughts? I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we didn't end up podcasting on Reformation Sunday. We've certainly talked or Reformation Day. We've talked about it a lot.
Reformation Friday. It was Friday.
Yeah. So what do you think is the relationship between the current Protestant landscape and the heritage of the Reformation?
Very little.
Yeah, I think the same thing. I think it's a different religion. It's almost a different religion.
I think the average. Well, I mean, it depends. If you like, let's think about Protestantism. Like liberal Protestantism would be different. So I'll say some things about evangelical Protestantism.
Okay.
I think the average evangelical Protestant, if you throw them back to the 16th century, would have said, medieval Catholicism, this isn't so bad. In some sense, you're working out your own salvation. You've got relics.
Right.
They love relics. They love little saints, and they like the prayer of Jabez, and they like in some sense, like all the things that you would see as excess, as Luther would see as excesses and extra biblical and add-ons and things that weights on the people. I think the evangelicals would love.
Or they have their own version of that, right? They have their own version of folk religion.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're under the umbrella of evangelical or Christianity. I don't even know how much they use that evangelical term anymore. But it's not that dissimilar from, like you said, there is contemporary versions of indulgences. There are thinly veiled pagan ideas that are quite prevalent, and you're like
sometimes not even thinly veiled.
Thinly veiled. There's just different kinds of icons, different kinds of totems that are used. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. So, is there just a natural? I mean, you have this combination of extra traditional, extra biblical things that get laid on Christianity, which has always happened, plus the natural, enmeshment of a particular Christianity with society, sometimes to the point where it does no longer looks very much like the religion of Paul or Jesus.
Yeah, there's all of that. So so we have these sorts of issues, and then you would take liberal Protestantism, and with liberal Protestantism, isn't even interested in this sort of stuff anymore. I mean, I think that there's, I think the idea of if the heart of the Reformation, if at the heart of it is the division between synergism and monergism, like to what degree is divine energy, I sound Eastern Orthodox saying that, but I'm just using shorthand. But like,
right.
is divine initiative, divine will, divine grace, divine energy, divine initiative, the whole ball of wax, right? Is faith even a gift that the Spirit brings with the proclamation, or is it to some degree more of a cooperative, synergistic project? I mean, on one level, I want to say liberal Protestants are more synergistic, but then again, I don't even think there's an interest in these questions.
No,
generally. There's just
not so
not. I
much.
mean, you have to be interested in religious psychology. You have to be interested in the existential turmoil of the soul and how one sort of gets right with God and to what degree this is how these things, like what you have to be really interested in theological anthropology and things like this. And I think in liberal Protestantism, that's just not what stirs the pot in
No.
general in those circles, right?
Right. No, they're I think it's good work, social transformation. I think those are the kind of
Inclusion.
inclusion. Again, it's I always get this wrong, but the Baha'i
Baha'i. They have
faith.
nice temples. Nice
I was
temples.
talking to a guy, a person the other day who was really influenced by them, and he's disillusioned because it doesn't look like things are getting better. But I don't know that there's something about the best of that Baha'i and the best of liberal Protestantism that is kind of a I want to say utopian might not be the right word, but there's this idea that humanity is moving in a better way. God is part of it. What exactly God is in those systems isn't necessarily always that clear, but there's this kind of, we're making progress. I mean,
You are articulating this so well; it's scary.
Well, because I'm around it
Jones,
all the time,
you're
right?
doing quite well. This is
Yeah, but again,
you're
I'm still not sure how those ideas survived Verdun and Verdun, the bloodbaths of World War One. I mean, the one thing that like whether you're Lenin or whether you're Adolf Hitler um, or Mussolini, you come out of that situation saying, "We're not going to do these things. We're going to do something different now." And humanism isn't quite the way to go. Um, so that's what I find fascinating a little bit about somebody. And again, there's some admirable ideals in it. Who doesn't get chills um, listening to Martin Luther King and particularly that speech the night before he's killed. I mean, we all want to hope that's right, but
But see, I think King doesn't fit well into that camp because I was thinking it's just King. I mean, one part of the reason King, anti-Vietnam, severe doubts about capitalism. I mean, I was reading this radical Substack today. This guy who's he's firmly on the left, and he was saying that he has this great quote that like he's saying like liberalism, what good liberals have done. He was sort of saying where like he was making the case for strikes and for non-compliance, like the most extreme forms of nonviolent
right,
protest in the face of Trump. And he's saying the problem with liberalism is it puts the best face on the system.
right,
It sort of is an apologetic for what capitalism could be, and so it chews around the edges these little stopgap reforms,
right.
and it really ultimately perpetuate. And this is King. I mean, King dies
Well, yeah,
because he's
no,
he's at the sanitation worker strike. He's
well,
about to
right.
do that.
Well, again, and that's why, in some levels, the influence, Martin Luther King's influence, probably peaked on the March in Washington. I mean, you can say that after 1963, certainly 1965, he no longer was as influential as he was, and maybe part of that was his these kind of things. I mean, what you just described there is the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton, Al
Yeah,
Gore.
absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah, I mean
absolutely.
that's um, again, I'm not quite sure what Barack Obama could have done or would have done if he had either a little more experience at legislating or was not constantly working with a Republican Congress that it was its only job was to prevent him from being successful. Although he couldn't get it done except for Obamacare with a Democratic Congress. So you know it's an interesting thing. I mean, you might say that Joe Biden was an attempt to go back to a more New Deal, Great Society kind of liberalism, but we see. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Joe Biden uh, legacy is tarnished right now. But
Oh, look, I heard it's the most corrupt president in the history
right,
of the
right,
republic.
right.
I heard it. I heard it. It's the
So,
auto
but it
pen,
was
bro.
this. So what's interesting is in many ways the Christian century, the great Protestant liberal Christian century was over before it started. They just didn't know it. It's kind of like I just reading Halik, his commentary on Vatican II was they were trying to catch up to modernity when modernity was already
Pass it
over,
by,
passed
passed it
by.
by.
And I think American liberalism, Protestant liberalism, um, in
Lenin
many
read a
ways,
book on Marx by the quartet practiced in the park.
and we
He
sang
sang
dirges
dirges in the
in the
dark the
dark.
day the music died. Yeah, so all this stuff. I mean, I think for thinking about the Reformation, I was thinking about this today, and I think Luther, when he looks back and thinks about the most important thing he wrote the end of his life, he goes to 1525, not to 1517. It's the Bondage of the Will.
Right,
And he thinks everything flows from there. And,
right.
Erasmus is sort of discharged by the church to go sink Luther, right? I mean, he's the Ivan Drago, he's
Well,
the,
he's the most influential public intellectual in
exactly. And
Christendom. Yeah,
he's a humanist, right? So he knows texts, he knows how
right,
translation, so he can go toe to toe for Luther on sources and things like this. So, he and Erasmus sees this. What's interesting about this whole thing, Erasmus decides I'm not going to go to papacy. I'm not going to go indulgences. I'm not going to go sacraments. I'm not going to go just. I'm going to go where I think the thing is, on the freedom of the will.
Well, and he may have agreed with Luther about all the things you just said he didn't go after. Right?
Right. He's not exactly. He sees the needs for reform. He sees the problem. But it's funny because Luther translates. It's funny. Luther says to Erasmus in response when he writes the Bondage of the Will, he says, "You and you alone have seen the question on which everything hinges, and have aimed at the vital spot." Stephen Paulson, the guy that wrote The Outlaw God, one of our friend Adam Morton's teachers, translates that you went for the jugular. And so this is a moment of clarity, right? Like Luther sees and is paying him some respect here and saying, like, yeah, you get it, right? Like if this is it, right? If this is the whole ball of wax, you found it, right? And it's like water from a duck's back. If you buy what Luther thinks, what he sees in the entirety of the scripture, at the heart, of course, of St. Paul and Augustine, and this sense in which before God, we're pretty helpless, right? That we are not in need of hospitalization, but resuscitation, right? We're not in. We need not a treatment plan, but death and resurrection. If that's how urgent you think the case is, and how bad the patient is, now the patient's a corpse, right, or something, then you have one approach to the problem. Now, if you think it's decidedly different, that there's, the case is not so dire. It's significant. You need grace, but then grace needs to be cooperated with. And it's funny because I think the way this is like sort of, I think, at the heart of the thinking here, right? Which I think puts this stuff into relief. Erasmus kind of says, look, in his treatise, of course, there's some passages on free will, that seem to evince free will in the scriptures. There are some passages that seem to say we're not free. Scripture's murky. Scripture's messy. It's complex. And the tradition realizes this. And what's a believer to do? The Bible's a complicated document.
Right.
So what you do is you trust the grace of the church, and you trust the church tells us we have to have a free will. I mean, we love Augustine. Okay? Nobody loves Augustine more than we do. But you got to water you can't go give me a double shot of Augustine neat, or else, what the hell? Erasmus is basically, if you do that, you're gonna have Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. If you give priority to these passages that seem to say what you think they do, Luther, so we've got to go with Mother Church, and we've just got to go with you have to have free will, right? It's
not only Mother Church; it's at some levels the classical ethical tradition as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which Luther says, Luther could say reason is a whore, right? That this is, that this is not. And, it's interesting because he kind of plays, he'll say like, Erasmus, you think, okay. When you go to take the Eucharist, right? You go up there and you take it. You say, this is my body given for you, for the forgiveness of sins. You're sitting there and think, is that for you, Erasmus? Is that for you? You say, you're going to be Renaissance humanists. You're going to say, well, all right. Mark doesn't say it. Does say it in Matthew, though. But he does say it to his disciples. And it is the immediate context. Is it to his disciples? I know. Well, what we have to say is the church can say it's for you. And what we have to say is faith, in matters of faith, this is murky and faith is uncertain. In matters of uncertainty, what do? Part of faith is to trust the church and trust what the church has told us in the midst of this ambiguity, right? This is you go to Papa, Thank God we've got one from Chicago, 135 bishops or something, Bill, 150 votes. The first Chicago Pope.
Bam.
15 more votes than the Cardinals. They didn't know how to do it in Chicago. But you go and you trust, right? And Luther would say, no, that's not what faith is. Faith is, the promise, it's trusting in the promise. And the promise of Christ is the one thing, of course it's for you. And that's the only certainty you have in this life, right? Is that the promises of Christ are true for you, right? Pro nobis. for you. And that's, this is for Luther. He thinks the whole thing gets down to whether or not, the whole thing is God on our side, right? The great Dylan song, by the way. Tragic, and it's
Right. It's not a good.
tragic,
It's
tragic song.
yeah. It's not. It's not the good version of God being on our side. No.
But is God for us? And if God is
Right.
for us, of course, the apostle says, who can be against us? And he thinks either you have God for us, in the eternity of eternities, right? That God is unwaveringly for us, and then that he thinks that changes, the nature of the Christian life, or that's an ambiguous prospect, and that ultimately, you're when you're thrown on your will, right? And Luther thinks, and it's interesting because there's our friends from Mockingbird will appreciate this. There's our listeners and friends. There's a lot of law gospel stuff actually in the Bondage of the Will, and Luther thinks what you're doing is turning all these texts into laws, and then you say, well, if I turn everything into imperative, it's kind of like, well, can I do it or can I not do it if it's imperative? And what does it take to do it? What is it? And then that throws me back on my will, and then ultimately, you're thrown back on your own capacities, right? And Luther thinks, and this gets into sort of the freedom of the Christian, sort of on Christian liberty, the treatise. He thinks quite the opposite. You're actually going to have more moral freedom for your neighbor because you're not going to be so obsessed about your own accomplishments that that once you're finally you're convinced of the unconditional favor and love of God, that you're then actually free to think about, not think less of yourself, but think of yourself less, right? That actually get the question off your own anxiety and your own determination in your eternal destiny and whatnot. So that, Bill, I think Luther thinks is at the heart. After the second half of 1517, but still quite important. We're gonna have Brother Adam back at some point to see if he thinks my fast forwarding to the essence of things in 1525 is indeed correct.
Yeah. So I guess the question is that that Lutheran rubric, which he interpreted, everything is justification by faith, right?
Yep.
So has that? Well, we don't need to argue the fruits of that in Luther's own life or in his own movement, but what's the state of that idea in American Protestantism in 2025?
Yeah, I think it's not great. I mean, I think there are some people that get it, right? I mean, I think our friend Brother Morton gets it, and gets it not as an entryway, not as. I mean, I think that certain evangelicals get it as the entryway, as a one-time deal. Like, you're justified by faith once, then you're pretty much on your own.
Well, that's it collapses everything to that. The Christianity that I was reared in collapsed everything to that born again moment, right?
Right.
And so that's and that it tied Luther's idea of what's really in the heart of God is something that has to happen in an instantaneous experience.
And I think it's interesting that you could see two modern outworkings of this, right?
Yeah,
one would be that evangelicalism, which says it's all about decision, right? Your decision for Christ, which you don't find decisional theology really in Luther. The opposite would be Barth's inclination to say, really, it's not just about God's decision for you, but the pro nobis doesn't even end with you. It goes to the heart of God. That there's an eternal election going on in the heart of God. That God's being is eternally pro nobis, for us. That God's decision about us even involves an eternal decision about the way God chooses to be God.
Right. So all we are invited into the mind of God, Bart.
Yeah, or the heart of God, or something.
Heart of God, that he had privileged position.
Yeah, so I think there are pockets. I mean, I think Michael Horton. I mean, I think, look, they just had a conference, the 1517.org people, who I know some of those folks. I know one guy. who I've interacted with at a couple conferences, but those folks just had a whole conference on the bondage of the will and free will and stuff. But I think it's also existentially. I think you see the fruits of this in modern culture, right? Ultimately, Luther has lost this battle, right? I mean, it's just
Right.
not just in the church, but in the world, right? I mean, you contrast the bondage of the will with Nietzschean will to power, which I think is not totalitarian in Nietzsche, but it is just like
Right.
self-actualization on
Right.
steroids,
Right.
right? But
Right.
it's all about your capacity to will your own sort of actualization and things you can do in the world. And isn't this what we see, that everything is about the will, even your own gender, right? So that now
Right.
we have
Yeah.
so many people who have confusion about their gender identity. Not that, I mean, look, I think some of that is real and some of it's psychological and some of
Well,
it's
real. I mean, real.
hormonal.
Yeah, the real might be. What do you mean? You got to watch the word real.
Oh, right, yeah, exactly. Some
Yeah.
of it is rooted, I think, in depth psychology and biology. A lot of this though is rooted in you've got to, that not only do you have a will that's free, but you've got to will everything. That from the cereal aisle to the app store to Marva Dunn
Right.
had this great phrase years ago, and she this is prophetic, right? Because she wrote this before we all had computerized worlds in our pockets. But she said, we intimise our technology and technologize our intimacy. Right. So your
Mm.
phone says, "Hi, Bill. What would you like?" Whatever, and then we connect with people via text message and
Right.
emojis and all these things. So it's this world where we will everything, right? And I think this thing where you are the prisoner of libertine, so-called libertine freedom would be a nightmare, I think, to Luther. But
Well,
that's what we consider true freedom.
well, isn't some levels that's the misreading of Luther by what is it that most Protestants, if they know anything about Luther, they know, you know, my conscience is held captive to the Word of God.
Yeah, right.
And um, that really is not, what they used to say in the Presbyterian Church, God alone is Lord of the conscience,
Yeah,
really meant for them, I alone am Lord of my conscience.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's reduced to sort of American libertarian sort of. Yeah, I mean that's not what Luther's talking about, right?
Would Luther would we have been better off if Luther had taken away of Staupitz as opposed to the route he took? Because
Uh,
most of his ideas came, I mean, his whole idea of the centrality, grace, and love of God came from his Catholic spiritual director.
maybe look, I mean, couldn't you get a lot of this out of Augustine? I mean, you wouldn't get Luther's
Yes,
understanding of justification out of Augustine, but ultimately an Augustinian concept of the will and an Augustinian concept of predestination gets you a long way to where Luther is,
or
right?
the grace alone and piety. Now again, you certainly can find it in Bernard of Clairvaux. Now again, you could say Bernard of Clairvaux lived a monastic life, but his idea of centrality of the love of grace of God, it's in Bernard of Clairvaux. It's in Bonaventure. I mean, there's that kind of the part of the Augustinian. I mean, you can see it. It's in some of the Victorine, right? The writing of like Richard of Saint Victor. So, and I, Saint John of the Cross.
Well, we just talked about Lovelace, right, a couple of
Yeah,
episodes ago, right? And Lovelace sees this spiritual renewal. I mean, he sees it in justifying grace and how this justifying grace takes hold of you and you feel this new rootedness in the love of God, and that frees you up for acts of service and a new kind of piety and all this stuff. And Lovelace sees it all over the media. He sees
right.
this. It's not something Protestantism invented. I mean, Lovelace sees it throughout the history of the church. That
But and it was this, and Protestant at its best, I think, was caught that spirit, right? I could, one of the funniest things, the first time, maybe the first, I read two medieval books that were referred to me in the fundamentalist circles I was involved in as a young adolescent. Uh, Brother Lawrence, Practicing the Presence of God. You could buy that at fundamentalist bookstores, and Thomas à Kempis.
The Imitation of Christ.
The
Yeah.
Imitation of Christ, which I would say, that is not, that probably is some, that ideology in that book probably has more influence in some ways than Luther does, and it creates some of the very things Luther was trying to reform us from, right? That kind of, that in his steps becomes a kind of a different kind of legalism.
A follower of Jesus, unlike me, Bill, who was a fan.
Well, I think Luther would not be happy with that language either.
A fan of Jesus
But I
Christ.
guess the question is, so does it make any sense to still talk about an ongoing Protestant Reformation? And I mean, we both are just reading Halik's book, and Halik talks about us being in the afternoon of Christianity, and he he pushes the envelope as a Roman Catholic about what he thinks should happen next. But I would argue that maybe even a more radical thing needs to happen in Protestant circles than he says it needs to happen in Roman Catholic circles. In some levels, the Roman Catholics need to take the best of the spirit of the Reformation, priesthood of all believers, church that takes place outside the bounds of the building. I mean, that's simplistic, and we'll talk, I'm sure, over the next months, we'll talk about Halik more. But isn't part of what Protestant needs to do is to get back to what it was protesting against? And I mean, and again, that doesn't mean a continuation of anything that's called Protestant, because frankly, it's self-destructing at its own hands, right? It's not. I mean, it's not like it's become some levels so removed. A lot of Protestant groups are so removed from even the source of Protestantism that they're unrecognizable. And you argue, at what point does something become a new religion? That's a whole other subject. But is there any good reason? You and I are on the record of saying that we're accidental Protestants. I was reading. I just lost his name. The Irish philosopher Carney.
Yeah.
That right. And he says that he instead of we used the word accidental Protestant versus essential Protestant, he uses the term that he is intellectually a Protestant and emotionally a Catholic.
Yeah.
Now, I think I might be more intellectually a Catholic, and you might be more emotionally a Catholic, just because you like to show up for the Eucharist, and that's it.
I'm a fan. I'm a big fan. I'm a huge fan of Jesus.
So. I guess
I'm on record as a fan of Jesus.
That's right. So I guess the question is there? Should we even? I mentioned Luther in my sermon. We didn't sing to him, but I did talk. I used him in an illustration. I was talking about Romans 7, and part of my illustration was he got it wrong. But he got Romans. You'll appreciate. He got Romans 7 wrong from a Pauline perspective, but the fact that he saw human alienation in Romans 7, he got the human experience right. That's part of the reason why it doesn't matter what Paul meant in chapter Romans 7. We can't help but see our own struggle when we read
Yeah, right. Yeah, this is exactly. This is Paul. Paul might have spoken more universally than he intended to there. So,
well, also, I think you can argue, and again, I'm reading McGowan's book too. You can argue that Paul is, or that Luther's both the last medieval man and the first modern man.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But both things are both those. But I mean, the contradictions in Luther are not just because he's a peasant guy with a foul mouth and an anti-Semitic disposition. I think he has a foot in both worlds. He has a foot in two epics as well as two traditions, and that's a hard place to be consistent in if you're in that place.
And let me say that I think it's another place where people argue that Luther got it wrong, which is fine. It's in Galatians, right?
Right.
When you're talking about works of the law, that this is not talking about acts of piety and devotion that they're sort of earning you spiritual credits or something. That this is identity markers, right? That these are cultic and namas. The law. This is the covenant markers, right? And that's
right. In a backdrop of a Judaism that felt very much under attack, and it turned out that it was. Right. I mean, that's why Galatians is an argument against Christian nationalism.
Yeah. See, this is exactly. See,
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
the hammer for Luther would come down today on that sort of on identitarianism and all of its stripes, right?
right,
Because it's all
right,
will to power, right? And it's all this idea that if I will an identity, and then I can assert myself, right? And whether that's whatever kind of tribal identity, but you see this, right? You see this in there's tons of work done on this right now about the MAGA folks
right,
who have reignited their faith, but it has not led to them going to church or to traditional Christian practice or anything like that. But they have a stronger sense of being Christian now because of it. And it's just identitarianism. Like that's all it is, right? This is will to power in the worst, darkest sense of the word, right? And so this would be, and this is for Luther, an obvious work of the law, right? This is an obvious sort of thing that my will asserts to make me feel valuable, to make me feel as though I have meaning, and that there's something transcendent and significant about my willing, and that is just. So I mean, I think there's so much that speaks to today, but largely. I mean, where's the crowd for that? Well, you know what? Who knows? Maybe it's where our friend of the show, Ben DeHart, is up there preaching the stuff in Brooklyn,
right,
and there are people showing up. As his
well, and I think Luther's critique of the problem of a theology of glory as opposed to theology of a cross.
Oh yeah,
That would be as fresh as any time he's ever that would be as fresh now and as important and as prophetic and as maybe controversial now as it was then, and maybe even needed even more so now.
Amen to that. Well, Bill, thank you.
Thank you always, friend. And a week from today.
A week from today, live in Vermont. If you're in driving distance from Manchester, Vermont, come see us. We're going to do a live podcast.
We'll be at the.
We will solve all the problems. We're going to give you a plan about what to do about Christian nationalism. People are going to say this is when there was an alternative path. Two roads diverged in a wood, and we took the road less traveled by. And it made all the difference. We went with NPW.
And by the way, Robert Frost is buried just down the road from me here, so we should make a pilgrimage to Robert Frost's grave.
Maybe we'll visit his grave.
And Scott is so optimistic about the solutions we're going to come up with. He's asking me for maps on how to sneak into Canada.
I have to just to keep it fair, just keep it honest. You gotta keep your options open.
All right. It involves a boat and rowing. That's all I can tell you. All right. All right, guys.
All right, everybody. Peace out.
Peace.